Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Israel's Famine in Gaza, What the World Must Know, hosted by the Institute for Palestine Studies USA. We're grateful to have you with us for this urgent conversation, and especially thankful to our speakers for accepting our invitation on such an extremely short notice. We're joined today by Bushra Khalidi, Palestinian Territory Policy Lead at Oxfam, and Dr. Yara Asi, Assistant Professor at the University of Central Florida, an expert in global health and human rights. This discussion will be moderated by Laith Malhis, a researcher on IPS's Health Destruction Database team. You can find full speaker bios in the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Laith to begin. تفضل Laith.
Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Under ordinary circumstances, I would start by expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to participate at an IPS-led event. But as we gather here today, we are faced with circumstances that defy humanity. Instead, our gathering carries the weight of urgency, tragedy, and necessity. Given that it's already 9 p.m. for colleagues joining from Palestine, we will conclude promptly at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. Today's session will include 4 to 5 questions posed to our panelists, providing space for their remarks and reflections. While we won't have the opportunity to field live audience questions, we strongly encourage attendees to follow our databases and our blogs and the good work that's done by Palestinians and their allies. So thank you to our panelists for agreeing to join us on such short notice. As you've seen from the title of this webinar, Israel's ongoing engineered famine in Gaza has enforced through siege, blockade, genocide, and since March, the targeted destruction of aid distribution networks has already killed approximately 154 Palestinians from malnutrition. Within that number, 89 are children. Added to the over 900 Palestinians killed while seeking food from the US and Israeli-backed GHF distribution sites. Despite the growing number of deaths, aid remains systemically blocked and weaponized. And while diplomatic actors have publicly celebrated recent airdrops and so-called quote-unquote humanitarian pauses, those pauses have been anything but humanitarian. They are unilateral, short, uncoordinated, and deadly. And Palestinians, as we speak, are being killed every hour. So I want to begin with my first question to Bushra. How did we get here? This didn't begin with a famine, and we know that it didn't begin in March when the total blockade on humanitarian aid was enabled. To many, this is the result of decades of policy. So can you help us trace how Israel has pushed Gaza to this point through years of siege, enforced dependency, and systemic deprivation?
Thanks so much for having me. And for this, sober introduction. And I echo that, it's been some of definitely the hardest times in the last 24 months, in particular as a humanitarian worker. We're now at a point where the worst case scenario, as the IPC said and clearly stated, it's not looming anymore, it's here. And the worst case scenario, famine is currently playing out in the Gaza Strip. And this is not, of course, just a humanitarian catastrophe. It is constructed, morally unconscionable, and politically enabled atrocities through starvation, which amount to crimes against humanity and potentially genocide. And as a Palestinian humanitarian worker, I no longer have the luxury of speaking in, these careful technical terms. What we're witnessing in Gaza is not the breakdown of systems. It's the deliberate dismantling of life, and the starvation of my people is being engineered by Israel. As we speak, so the IPC confirms it, but I mean, humanitarians have been saying it since the beginning of this total siege. Of course, Gaza has been under siege, and systematically deprived of essentials of life for the last 18 years. And this has always included, restrictions on food and water and medicine and fuel and electricity and materials and construction materials. And then the total siege in October 2023 comes in, where officials announced no food, no fuel, and no electricity. And that policy remains in place in all but name. And it's now since March 2nd that INGOs, Palestinian civil society, who have been at the front lines of the humanitarian response in Gaza in the last in the last 18 years, but in the last 24 months, including UN agencies, have been completely silent and replaced by the Israeli US scheme of these, distribution sites that have become basically killing fields, death traps, whatever you want to call them, and are nothing human. There's nothing humanitarian or even aid about it, really. And the destruction of food systems in Gaza, of the bombing of water infrastructure. That has been also a deliberate policy from Israel since 2008 and the beginning of the siege, and a policy that has played out in enormous ampler in the last 24 months, including the bakeries, the aid convoys, the deliberate blocking of the humanitarian entry points. None of this is incidental. We had hygiene kits. We had hygiene kits denied 2 days ago by the Israeli authorities, and the reason, and these were hygiene kits that were ordered early on, but they turned out to be too big for women because they've lost so much weight, and so we've had to reorder them and then bring them into Gaza, and now they've been denied and Israeli, and has been systematic over the war and for Oxfam's materials included. And these are acts that fall squarely under, the Genocide Convention. This is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. I mean, there's no more definitions because they are coordinated measures that have rendered Gaza now uninhabitable.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that, Bushra, and I also agree with both the appreciation to IPS for holding this and the difficulty in kind of talking about this as we're also witnessing these atrocities on a wide scale. Alex Duvall, who is a kind of global famine expert, he studied famine all over the world, and his main argument, I think, if you were to distill it, and I think he'd agree with this, is that famine is in the modern age not natural. It is completely man-made everywhere famine occurs. And famine only is able to occur when the series of processes are able to happen consecutively. So let's look before 2023. There was a UN study in 2022 that showed that almost 3/4 of households in Gaza were food insecure because of the pre-existing blockade. As Bushra said, there has been concerted efforts to limit the ability for people in Gaza to provide for themselves in terms of food, both in terms of building food factories, which have been bombed in previous attacks on Gaza in the past. The very tight, dense space in Gaza because people, the population is growing, but Israel obviously does not permit the land to grow. So the amount of land for agriculture, for livestock, for crops is extremely limited. Even though Gaza is a coastal territory, for decades we've been hearing about fishermen getting shot and killed if they go beyond certain points in the sea, and obviously for them, the best fish and the best catches are far out there. I've seen videos just in the past week of fishermen getting taken off their boats. So from every possible mechanism, before we even talk about the aid, Gaza was unable to properly feed itself before 2023 and was highly dependent on aid. And this was a very well-known and understood problem, of course, for the Palestinians in Gaza and for people who studied this issue. So then when you hit the point where everything is bombed, houses, food factories, land, animals have been killed, the sheep and the cows have all been killed. And then once you have created a situation where people can no longer feed themselves, they are basically 100% dependent on aid. Then when you manufacture this aid scheme that, as we've all seen, not only doesn't feed them and definitely doesn't feed enough people, but literally is killing people. I mean, basically every day, dozens of people are dying trying to get food. It is absolutely no surprise that we have been to this point. And the purpose of these kinds of, genocide conventions, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc., is not to criticize them after they happen. It is to prevent them as we witness them start to happen so that we are not to the point where we are now. And I know we'll talk about this in a little bit, where for many people, it is already too late. Even if they are alive today, even if there was going to be in 1 minute a sudden influx of double, triple, quadruple the amount of aid, that is no longer a sufficient solution. So you manufacture the conditions for famine, and then you essentially make it impossible to combat. And that is the situation that we're in today. So this has been building and building for decades, and we are only now hitting the point, I think, within the last week, where people are finally starting to pay attention. And it seems like it took the near skeletal bodies of babies to convince them, which is really absurd.
Yeah, yeah. It's when you both put it into this context, there is a structure at play, and its structure started well before October 7th, and can be traced back, unfortunately, to both the Nakba and 1967, on this rendering Palestinians the ability to be sovereign, independent. Um, yeah. So now that we've grounded how we got here, I want to turn to where we are right now. And I know you both work with people on the ground, and so if you're able to kind of let us know what the current scale and depth of Israel's starvation in Gaza today, what are you seeing and what are you hearing from, and what have you been able to track on the ground, and how does this differ from what's being acknowledged or ignored by the international institutions and media coverage? I know, Bushra, you talked a little bit about this, but if you can expand on it, I would really appreciate it.
I mean, where do we start? It's a big question on what's happening on the ground. I mean, when it comes to at least Oxfam operations, we have been, largely inoperational since March 2nd. We've not been able to enter any materials because of the U.S. Israeli scheme. You have seen, I mean, many more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed and shot at these distribution sites. They are designed to corral the population because what's something that people are not really did not put one and one together is that the forcible displacement orders that have been occurring since the beginning of March. There's almost been two a day. This was up to a month ago. There were almost two a day forcible displacement orders, and forcing the population down south. And then, locating 4 distribution sites instead of the original 400 that we had across the strip are now basically mostly down south. And so corralling a civilian population that is exhausted, that is traumatized, that has not been, by the way, starving since, again, I mean, you've put it clearly, Yaro, thanks, but exactly, it's not, this is pre-2023, but of course, we even in the first 3 months of siege, in January 2020, early 2024, I don't remember what month, sorry, but the IPC already was assessing food security in Gaza since then. So, it's been since the beginning. It's not, sudden famine that's happened. And now we're seeing basically people, the Palestinians deciding on whether I'm feeding my children today, or getting killed and getting shot by some of them U.S. mercenaries, basically shooting indiscriminately at stampedes of crowds, and humanitarianism. And I think it's really important. I want to underline this. When we talk about humanitarian response, what it means is that we meet the needs of the most vulnerable population. Now, everybody in Gaza is vulnerable, sure, but some are more vulnerable than others. People with disabilities, people with amputations, pregnant women, children. Half of Gaza are children. So these are the vulnerable population, and it's not just about meeting the needs of the vulnerable populations, meeting the needs of the vulnerable populations wherever they may be. Not in 4 locations, and this is where you come and, how is a pregnant, and we have heard stories of pregnant moms going to these distribution sites, risking their lives, stampeding, right? Because it's a first come, first serve situation. It's not based on need. Stampeding to get food, and then there's this trickle of UN trucks, and then we're giving token gestures. The IDF announced tactical pauses, airdrops. This is a facade. This is a smokescreen. This is to manage the headlines. This is not to address the needs of the civilian population that is still facing famine right now. And I can talk more about kind of like health impacts of starvation on children, and we've been also listening to the stories. I mean, I have a colleague of mine whose sister is in the south, and she is in Gaza City. She gives an empty bottle to her baby to distract the baby because the baby is so hungry. Some babies don't cry because they're so hungry and they're so weak that they can't even cry. So this is what we're talking about in Gaza. And I think it's important to talk about these stories. My colleague, I spoke to her last Thursday. She went to work with one piece of falafel, to work with no water, no bread all day, and she's working. So the situation it's I have no adjectives because I think we need to describe it, but I don't, and I don't want to describe it in numbers and IPC figures. Like this is what we're hearing, and it's unconscionable and inhumane and absolutely, and by design, and this is what's important, man-made. I live in Ramallah. I'm an hour and a half away from Gaza. I could drive to Gaza in 1 hour and a half in my car. There's an abundance of food and water kilometers away. I have family in Gaza. My husband is from Gaza. All his family is in Gaza. I'm sitting here and I work for Oxfam, which was an organization that was set up to prevent famine. Like, that's why we're called Oxfam. That is our bread and butter: food security, livelihoods, water, sanitation, working with farmers. I mean, that is the crux of our jobs and our work here. And I'm here and a humanitarian worker and a Palestinian, and I have family an hour and a half away, and I can't get to them. That is what famine by design means.
Yeah, to echo Bushra's words, this is no longer a hypothetical. So, as of literally yesterday, the IPC, which Bushra referenced, which I guess we're now calling the Global Famine Watchdog kind of agency, as of yesterday, has said that their worst case scenario of famine, which again they have been warning about almost since I think spring 2024, is unfolding in the Gaza Strip. So that's as of July 29th, 2025. And famine means 20% of households at least face an extreme lack of food, and at least 30% of children suffer from acute malnutrition, and there is at least two minimum deaths per day that are non-trauma related. So these are hunger related deaths. And we have seen all of these parameters pass. And that's just with the numbers that we know. And like Bushra, I hate, using too many numbers because I feel like it can dehumanize the people that we're talking about. Because for each individual person, you say a number like 500,000 people are facing starvation. That feels almost so big, it's almost untouchable. But those are 500,000 people like Bushra's colleague, who are, so we've heard stories, many people are going up to 3 days without eating anything. And we've seen videos, obviously, of not just the starving children, but people losing hair, obviously people with pre-existing medical conditions who've gone without medical care, who are really suffering in hospitals without the ability to receive care. We know there's almost 60,000 pregnant women who are at very high risk for miscarriage or stillbirth, or newborns that are born significantly underweight and will likely face health problems for the rest of their life. Um, and organizations like Oxfam just last week, I think they were part of this statement that warned of imminent mass starvation. And we're still seeing these efforts of famine and starvation denial at the same time. So it really feels sometimes like you're living in an alternate universe where there's something so obvious, so cruel, so inhumane. It kind of feels like the thing that all of international law was meant to protect, starving an entire besieged group of people while bombing and displacing them at the same time. I mean, you couldn't write a scenario more relevant to why we created IHL and all of these other protections, and yet we're not seeing any of them invoked in Gaza. And all we're seeing at most is some Western allies of Israel kind of expressing sudden concern or condemnation, but there's absolutely really no effort beyond that. And it looks like Israel agreed to some minimal amount of aid. I'm not exactly sure what's happening there, but this is all a smokescreen, and this is completely insufficient. I know we're going to talk later about what is needed to help the population at this point. And what's extremely frustrating is what is needed now is many, 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 many times more than what would have been needed if these warnings were heeded many, many months ago. Just in February 2024, there was 216,000 metric tons of food delivered. March, we see the siege. Nothing was delivered from March to May. And in July, this past month, there was only 32,000 metric tons of food. That is almost 1/7 the amount that there was in February, which was already insufficient. So I think it's important to see that these are not abstract, outcomes. These are well-known outcomes. And I think it's really important for us, and I know we're going to discuss, but what this really means for people on the ground day to day. It's not just that they're starving today, it's that for 2 years almost, they have been displaced. Some of my friends and colleagues there have been displaced 10, 12, 15 different times. It started with an uncle's house, and then they went to a distant cousin's house somewhere else, and then they went to a hospital, and then that hospital was bombed, and then they found a shelter. That shelter was overcrowded, and then they found a makeshift structure. This is what people are living through. So they're not just hungry, they are deprived of absolutely everything needed to sustain life.
Yeah, I was thinking as you both were speaking about the weird. It doesn't seem real because when you both mentioned, pregnant women and how this is affecting the most vulnerable. GHF a few days ago put out this AI made picture saying it's Women's Day, as if like it's now a day for women to come only to grab food. Like this is some sort of like a park, like an amusement park for. So yeah, there's just when you contextualize what has actually happened on the ground, you recognize the depravity of all of this. And so I now jumping on to kind of going, what's going beyond like immediate numbers. I watched Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan yesterday on Al Jazeera, and she was arguing on a panel that even if aid had arrived tomorrow in full, the damage doesn't just disappear. And I think that's what people are like. When over the last week, there's been more talk about the famine and like the starvation, but she was arguing that like the issue is that this didn't start now, and it won't end when you open the floodgates for aid to enter. And so I wanted to ask you both of you, what are the short and long term health impacts of this famine, especially on children and the other vulnerable populations, and the Palestinian men who are able? It's not just the vulnerable, of course. How does starvation now shape the future, physically, mentally, developmentally, and for those who survive? Because, as she mentioned yesterday, even if aid enters, there are going to be people who die tomorrow because of malnutrition.
Um, I mean, just to touch upon, just the top lines and the headlines these days, on the airdrops, I have been saying, and I think it echoes kind of the messaging of Dr. Tanya, who's has been an absolute hero, really. And all my kind of yeah, chapeau to her and to all the work that she's done and does and continues to do. Um, is, you think, it's like what we're seeing exactly. It's like even if you flooded Gaza today, but on the airdrops, like you think that at this point where children have been malnourished, starving, facing famine, because like these are the stages, right? You think that an
I think she might have cut out.
That's that infamous Ramallah internet.
Yeah, yeah. Just would give her a second. See if she can.
Hello?
Hi, sorry, we lost you
I
for a
cut.
minute. Yeah.
Um, I was saying that children that are their mothers was facing starvation or malnourishment throughout the last 24 months. I mean, let's be clear. Even if, they were not skipping meals, the meals that they've been having for the last 24 months are not, nutritious, well-balanced diet. We're talking about a lot of canned food, a lot of bread. There's nothing nutritious about bread. So, I think like also that, like nothing in terms of like, because of the restrictions and because of the delays and because of the bureaucracy that and we can talk maybe a little bit more about that, like of what, humanitarian organizations need to go through with the bureaucracy of Israel in order to get, hygiene kits in, is absurd and ludicrous and completely and opaque and, and arbitrary and all of that. But you will not, the harm has been done to children. And I think like when a child begins to starve, the body starts shutting down to preserve energy. His muscle mass is consumed, including like the heart. The immune system collapses. A simple cold, a simple, preventable illness becomes life-threatening. And I think I just want to put like a footnote here. Oxfam's analysis 2 weeks ago, in the last 3 months, we found that there's a spike of 302% of bloody diarrhea, 150% spike in acute watery diarrhea, and 105% spike in jaundice, hepatitis. And diarrhea and infections that are easily treatable elsewhere, and here they're becoming deadly. And then their organs fail, and then their skin thins, and then their eyes recede, and then they lose the energy to cry, to eat, and then to live. And so now we're seeing like toddlers like brought to clinics with like bloated bellies, signs of severe, of course, acute malnutrition. A lot of children that stare blankly. That's also a symptom. We've heard of women. Of mothers tell us their children faint during the day. My own brother-in-law, we have 23 children in my family. He told me that they tell the children not to play, because if they play too much, they get dizzy and they can faint. And like Yara said, malnutrition doesn't end when food arrives. It leaves these children with irreversible damage, stunted growth, cognitive development issues, and a lifetime, of course, of probably weakened immunity. I mean, the impacts are beyond. Um, um, and also, it's not just about food. It's about this child needs a hospital. And that hospital needs fuel, and it needs repair materials and it needs clean water. And none of those things are available in Gaza. Fuel is restricted. There's only two tankers, I think, of 75,000 liters of fuel, which, runs, barely runs anything. I mean, you need maybe 4 or 5 times that to run the minimum operations in Gaza. He needs mental health support. How is he getting mental health support when he's displaced 10, 12 times? So the mental health impacts are profound. In 2021, I carried out a research where we interviewed 1,000 children in Gaza, and asked them a question like, what would you want to tell the world and the international community if you had a chance? And all of them said to us, we feel abandoned by 90%, over 90% of the children, and the respondent said, we feel abandoned by the international community. And, we don't have any message to tell them. I mean, and this was in 2021. I mean, imagine these children, if they are alive today. Well, there's no future, there's no hope, there's no dreams. So the psychological toll is just brutal for children, for their parents, for their families, because basically what we're teaching children in Palestine is that their cries are not going to be answered, and that the world will let them starve, and that their lives are disposable.
Yeah, just to add, hunger is one thing, and in some cases, hunger can be solved by food, but famine and severe malnutrition over many weeks and months is an entirely different animal that needs to be treated differently. So it may actually be counterintuitive, but you cannot actually just start refeeding, especially a child, what you would assume would be a healthy diet if they have been in severe malnutrition. Their metabolism of their body literally changes, literally adapts to keep them alive. And so if you just suddenly refeed them, they can actually die because they're because of cardiac arrest and organ failure. So I saw some tweets from nutritionists that are in Gaza, and they are begging not just for food, but for these therapeutic products like F75, which is a therapeutic milk product for children primarily, or I've seen these images of these peanut butter based bars, which I think they are about 500 calories per bar. And so many people are surviving off those, and they have some added nutrients because a diet is not just about calories. As Bushra said, for some people, there have been some measure of calories. They've gotten some bread, they find a falafel here or there, or they have some canned fish or some canned fruits or something. But you need vitamins, minerals, electrolytes. You need a balance of protein, carbohydrates, fats to have a healthy diet. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about children in these conversations. And that's because children's bodies, as Bushra said, are the most affected by long periods of hunger. Children are growing basically constantly. And so if there's any period of time where they are not getting adequate nutrition in those crucial growth periods, that is stunted growth that cannot be reversed. So when we talk about, and that is why we're seeing the starving children first. Children have lesser fat stores and are less able to handle these kinds of severe metabolic disruptions. So, but what I've heard from many famine specialists and experts is that for many adults who survive, because unfortunately many will die, especially the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions, is that what lasts forever, even after you have escaped the situation, is the psychological toll of famine. And what does it mean when you have 5 children and you only have enough food to feed a couple of them? Or what does it mean when your neighbor, who you know, who you trust, who has known you forever, comes to your door and begs you for food because they need some for their baby or their child, and you might have some, but you don't have any to give? These kinds of choices are being posed to people constantly, and we have good evidence that there's a survivor's guilt. There's a form of post-traumatic stress disorder that comes from living through those circumstances. So while children and the physically vulnerable, including pregnant women and the disabled and the elderly, will have the highest physical toll, we should not assume that anyone who gets out of this alive does not have mental or physical scars that will last forever.
Yeah, thank you again for both for making that clear to us. So as my fourth question is related to sort of the role of NGOs and the international community and the humanitarian community, more or less. So as we've noticed and as we've stated, that Israel has strategically enacted famine of the course of the last 20, 21, 22 months. Beyond physically destroying Gaza's food systems, it has slowly worn down every diplomatic and political mechanism meant to prevent this. We've seen a pattern of how after each international rebuke, Israel allows just enough aid to quiet the outrage, only to turn around and to tighten its chokehold again, like we saw in March of this year. Given that, how has the media shaped or failed to shape the global understanding of what's happening? We've talked about how it's been over the last 2 weeks that there's been more talk about this. So, and also, what role does reporting, framing, and the repetition of euphemisms like food insecurity or humanitarian pause, quote unquote, play in enabling the strategy to continue without accountability? So if we could start with you, Bushra.
Um, Yeah, I mean, listen, I think I said it in the beginning, tactical pauses, 130 trucks or 200, 1,000, airdrops, floating piers, I mean, let's go back in the last 24 months and food distribution centers. And, it's not a logistical solution. And also this idea that the humanitarians are going to save 2.2 million Gazans is is absurd. I mean, what about the private sector? There's no economy and Oxfam, a big part of actually of our work is working with the private sector. We offered before the war, we offered a lot of like micro grants to, women to start like a bees cooperative, and we did like strawberry growing and, like all the kinds of things like that, where now even we were able actually during the siege to distribute seeds to small communities where they could find a patch to like grow some vegetables. In fact, one of the one of the communities in Dir al-Balah that we supported with seeds had their okra 2 week. Was it last week? I don't remember. 2 weeks ago, the okra had started to bloom, and that day when she saw the okra grow, she received a forcible displacement order, and there was the Deir al-Balah mass expulsion order on 2 weeks ago. So, the systematicness of it, and so these are cosmetic changes, right? This is just again managing headlines. It is not going to be one humanitarian aid that is going to solve the issues in Gaza. It's political will, and there's none. That's clear from, zero actions. I mean, again, because cosmetic changes, logistical solutions to a political solution, I mean, it's just never going to work. Gaza has been under siege for 18 years. Israel has reoccupied 88% of Gaza. So there's almost 2 million people, well, 1.5 million people, maybe a little less, now confined to basically essentially 12% or 14% of the Gaza Strip. Look at the West Bank. I mean, annexation is unfolding before our eyes. And it's the same kind of policies at a much wider, horrific scale in Gaza, like maybe not even comparable, but it is the same policies of, annexation, and collective punishment, and the systematic destruction of water and wastewater and infrastructure, and the influential states did not do anything before 2023. And they continue to do nothing and shield basically Israel's atrocities unfolding in Gaza, and use these cosmetic changes purely to ease their guilty conscience, because they know very well that these are not the because Israel is, has said to the world that it's not going to stop. So we have to force it to stop, and there are plenty of tools that are actually available to our policymakers. And I don't know who I'm speaking to. I mean, who's the kind of diverse group that I'm speaking to. And I'm sure I can see some questions in the chat, what should we do? I'm sure you're already doing what you should be doing, and you should be continuing to do what you should be doing. And if you're not doing anything on Palestine, you should start now. This is the moment for it. If not, we will allow an entire civilian population to be erased before our eyes live on our feeds. So, what international governments can do, I mean, it's first, how about we halt, the supply of weapons to Israel that is using those weapons to, engineer this starvation in Gaza. So that's like one thing. That's a very actually very quick thing that governments could be doing, and that no influential state has actually taken real measures to stop the transfer of weapons to Israel. Another thing is, for example, I don't know if we have EU colleagues here. I know I'm in DC, in the DC kind of area, but for the EU, being the biggest trade partner of Israel, and right now reviewing, because it has been reviewing for months, because policymakers, they love dialoguing, like public diplomacy and dialoguing. I mean, when do we take actions? At what point does the dialoguing end and we actually take concrete steps, concrete measures to hold Israel accountable? It is the impunity of Israel that has allowed us to get to here. It has laid the groundworks for that for decades. And it is now the role of the international community to actually prove that they care about the international rules-based order. They're not doing that. So this is the erosion of the international rules-based order before our eyes. And and it's not just about Gaza. Like, it's not just about the Palestinians right now starving in Gaza. It's about the rest of the world, because the precedents that have been set in Gaza with the use of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, military actors to distribute food, by the perpetrators themselves. I mean, how, in what world is that humanitarian? Is now being seen, by the way, in other conflict zones. And in other areas where we're seeing the same companies that were operating in Gaza and operating these logistics efforts in other places. So it is setting a precedent, and is, of course, bubbling regionally. We're on the brink of a regional kind of massive escalation. And so, I have no more words for how Western governments, the US, the EU have just allowed this horror to just go completely unchecked and enable it, and are complicit in what we're seeing unfold in Gaza. So what more can we do is we need to continue, having these discussions, and unfortunately, having to repeat these horrific stories that, I absolutely despise, that I have to sit, here and anywhere, to talk about, like starving colleagues, like, I mean, what world am I living in where I'm having to like repeat that 100 times in a day to journalists, etc. But I mean, we need to do this is part of the work, and I think a lot about like what the French resistance did during World War II, when against the Germans, like, and because I was born and raised in France, so that's kind of my historical references. But like it was hard work to support and hide Jews from the Nazis. It was extremely risky and exhausting and relentless work. And so I think right now we just have to make a commitment to that work. It's not going to. And like, I think I'm gonna take the parallel that Yara said. It's not by just giving food. Now we need to think about a long-term change, we need transformational change in Gaza, and we need accountability. That's just the basis of it. And then after accountability, we can, start talking about the rest of it. But that's what international governments, and that's what we should be doing right now and focusing on.
Laith, just to go back to your point about, the media and how they have perhaps assisted a permission structure that had allowed us to get to this point, because famine does not happen overnight. This famine did not happen overnight. This famine was warned about excessively with evidence, with data, etc. So I think there's a couple things, and I'm doing actually some research now with a group looking at media coverage of hospital bombings in Gaza. And there's a couple things that we have noted. Number one is, for much of the global media, the clock, when you talk about Israel-Palestine, resets with every major event. So this time around, the major event was October 7th, and the only stuff worth coverage was what happened on October 7th, and then a little bit of what happened after. Now there's a famine as of a week ago, so the media covers it as though it's just a brand new news development that is just now worthy of coverage. I rarely see in the articles about famine that Gaza has been under blockade since 2007, that there was pre-existing food insecurity, malnutrition, that one of the leading causes of death before 2023 for children in Gaza was bloody diarrhea and watery diarrhea because of lack of access to good water and nutritional treatments and medications. I rarely see any connection from the displacement in Gaza and at this point, just completely explicit calls for land seizure from Israeli politicians, settler organizations, etc. How easy would it be for the media to link that to the displacement and annexation of the West Bank? It is part of the same project. 40,000 displaced in the West Bank, and I barely hear about that. And when I do, it's mostly in Arab media. And I think this all goes to the main kernel, the main issue here, which is an unwillingness to link individual events, incidents, and statements to what many have argued for a very long time is the overall project of the Israeli state, which is what its previous prime ministers have said, which is what many of its current ministers say, which is to seize the land that is today called the occupied Palestinian territories, displace the Palestinians living on it. Let's call it voluntary emigration. We'll take the land, we'll turn it into the Singapore of the Mediterranean, and that's good for everyone. And, you know, sometimes even just, media won't even quote Israeli officials who say these kinds of things, or the Israeli official is seen as, well, this is a fringe person or this is a right-wing person, never mind that it's the finance minister or someone with, a real role in government, or the fact that there's been no punishment or punitive action of any kind for these statements that just seem to happen to come over and over and over and over, and just so happen to coincidentally match up exactly with what Israel's military is doing at the same time. There's an unwillingness to recognize this settler colonial project for that. It's a war. It's two neighboring countries. They've been fighting forever. It's just too complicated to understand. This is all smokescreen for the reality that I think and pray is becoming more apparent to people. The question is whether it's becoming apparent too slowly. And the last thing that I want to note is that every time there's an article about the famine, the Palestinians quoted are people living in Gaza, Gaza journalists, Gaza paramedics, or people like Dr. Haj Hassan, who are international physicians who have gone into Gaza. Not a single one of them have left saying something different than the others. They all say the exact same thing. But these are seen as biased, uncritical, perhaps even lying people. And yet the same article will, with no question, quote an IDF spokesperson or a spokesperson for the prime minister, and that is truth. So they said Hamas was at the hospital, so Hamas was at the hospital. They were also at that hospital and maybe every hospital, and they were also at every pharmacy and every school, and you know what I mean? So it's like this narrative that Israel has pushed, that this is a war of security. I think many within media that I speak to privately say that they recognize that that's not the case, but that's never how it's reported. So for the general public, perhaps for them, the famine was the first time that they realized, maybe something is amiss here, but that is not accidental. This could have been much more well reported. And for me personally, I don't see how months and months and months of videos and images of children with two amputations, the numbers of how many children orphaned, so many horrible things beyond tragedy have happened, both on individual scale and the collective scale, not to mention the whole collective trauma of Palestinians at this moment. But it is not reported as that. It is reported as individual humanitarian crises that can be managed with humanitarian response, more money. Let's write a white paper, or you know what I mean? It's just completely insufficient. So I think that's because the increasing reality is clear that there is no humanitarian solution to this. This is not new to Palestinians or many of their allies, but perhaps this is something new to much of the general public.
Yeah, I remember speaking with Dr. Yiping Ji a few weeks ago, and he had mentioned that there is this wide acceptance that the diagnosis is settler colonialism and the medicine is liberation. And I think there, as you both mentioned, that humanitarianism isn't going to solve this. It's actually liberation. Like there is this, we have come to a point where it's you have to either be fully Zionist to not accept this, or just completely awake and realize like you can't solve this. You literally simply cannot solve what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in historic Palestine, without understanding that like it's settler colonialism, and the way to ensure that the Palestinians get basic human rights is actually their liberation, is control over their land, and a recognition of their historical injustice. And to your point about journalists, I think both you and Yara and Bushra, you both mentioned this, that the doctors who go in, they'll tell you the same thing. And, what's now being spewed. I remember a week ago on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, they were questioning why journalists, the CNN isn't going in there, as if like we don't know what's going on, as if like we haven't had not biased or, just, regular people go in and tell you this is what's happening. You need the international, the Western, the American journalists to go in and tell you, to justify, or not justify, but to verify what's been said for 22 months now, which is quite frustrating because, again, it robs the Palestinian and their ally, of the ability to speak truth. And it also shows you again that when we talk about, in our millions, in our billions, we are all Palestinian, that it actually isn't just like Palestinian isn't a bloodline or, immediate connection to the historic land of Palestine. It's actually a consciousness, more or less. It's like if you believe that the people that live between the river and the sea deserve, rights, you are actually just considered Palestinian by the occupiers, the enablers of settler colonialism. But anyways, to jump onto action, because as we started by, this is an emergency webinar. It requires action. We don't just stop with our conversation here. I want to ask you both on action, because you both work in similar sectors, but also in different sectors. I wanted to see, what do you think is needed to address this crisis? I know we've touched on it, but in a more, in a more aggressive manner. What is needed to address this crisis? What kind of interventions are necessary? What role does Egypt, what role does the other Arab states play in all of this? What role do I, as somebody living in Washington, D.C., have or should play to give, like, the fact that to end this widespread malnutrition? If you can touch on what's actually possible as well, because we know that we can wish something and know something else is not possible. And what needs to happen immediately to stop the more deaths that are going to happen, regardless if we just end it now. So yeah, I'll start with you, Yara.
This is a huge question. This is one that Palestinians and their allies have wrestled with since 1948, is what do we do? And, so far we have only seen ourselves more subjugated, more of us killed, more of us displaced. So it's a really important and painful question in many ways. I guess I'll stick to the immediate, which is the obvious and very late answer is an immediate end to cessation of Israeli violence. There can be no meaningful humanitarian response as long as Israel maintains bombarding, sieging, holding land, calling 88% of Gaza militarized territory where people are not allowed to go. That needs to be the first step, because even when aid was quote unquote flowing through Gaza more easily, how many aid convoys were bombed? How many aid workers were killed? There was this is not you cannot bomb and say, we're allowing the aid convoys at the same time and call that a legitimate response. So that has to be the starting point. The second immediate action would be for Israel to open all land crossings. Most of the land crossings outside of Gaza, with the notable exception of Rafah, are through Israel. And Israel maintains, I believe, at least 14 different land crossings. Now, all of them have different capacity in terms of how many and how large of trucks they could include. And many of them have probably been destroyed, as have the roads that probably led from them to the areas. But there needs to be an opening of the crossings and an allowance of all the aid that is waiting in trucks at the border. We've all seen the videos to come in. Including not just food, but medicine, fuel for generators and electricity, and these kind of therapeutic refeeding meals that people need. In some extreme cases, there will be need for people to leave Gaza to receive care, and this should be with the explicit understanding that they will be able to return to Gaza when they have received that care, whether it's in Egypt or Europe or elsewhere. We heard stories from NGOs several months ago when there was a lot of medical evacuations that people were being allowed to evacuate only if they signed documentation that they would not return to Gaza. So obviously all of that needs to happen. The humanitarian response needs to happen. The defunding and delegitimizing of UNRWA needs to stop. We can have our quibbles and criticisms of UNRWA. Right now, they're the most capable and experienced agency on the ground in Gaza. And the continued delegitimization of them. People said at the time, humanitarian agencies said at the time, you can't replace UNRWA. its scale, its capacity, its centers. So we need to end those restrictions. There's, for individuals in Gaza, many have fundraising accounts through sites like Gaza Funds and the Samir Project. So for some people, their markets have some food, but the food costs are just so high that they cannot afford anything. So in those cases, just money sent person to person could be helpful. So that's the immediate, crisis. And then thinking long term about what happens to Gaza after this, that's I think a different question. But I think at this point, all mechanisms and levers of pressure need to be applied. We are past any point of return at this point when it comes to those things. So whatever sector you're in, I've seen many unions across many sectors organizing, endorsing sanctions or boycotts, etc. I've seen, people I'm in the public health world. I've seen people at such organizations who are advocating, who are calling for, various things from direct aid being given to even just having the organization recognize that there is a genocide or a famine or a need for a ceasefire. So whatever world you're in, even if you're just a student, to people in professional fields, we can affect our microcosm of a world. You don't have to, necessarily go on a public stage and speak about it. There are many ways that we can all intervene, but ultimately what will solve this is political pressure. So but the problem for me here is that we've already seen public polling shift so negatively against Israel. So we thought, let's get the people with us, let's get them to see the reality, and then maybe the governments will change. Well, more people are seeing the reality. More people are with us. We're not seeing government action reflect what the people want. Um, I'm not a political scientist. I don't know how to force politicians to do not just what you want them to do, but the thing that they are legally mandated to do. How many of these individuals, entities, organizations, nations are complicit in what is increasingly, and now basically everyone agrees, is genocide? How many nations hosted Netanyahu while he has a warrant for the ICC? So there needs to be not just accountability for Israel, but for all of its enablers.
Thank you for that. And Bushra, if you can end us off.
I mean, I really couldn't put it any better. I mean, I touched upon some of the things that, influential states, but Yara has said it, immediate permanent ceasefire, opening of all land crossings, funding of UNRWA, entry of food, materials, repair materials, machinery. I mean, the list is endless of what we need inside Gaza, solar panels. I mean, at scale, flexible funding for donors, for Palestinian civil society, the fundraising efforts, absolutely, that you can use money exchange and what's it called, Western Union. I mean, there are plenty of ways, and I think what I say to people is the reason why the world is with this is because, of course, it's inhumane, but also I think like we need to give credit to the advocacy that has been done on Palestine for the last, decades, which has laid the groundwork for where we are now in the public shifts. And it is so unfortunate that our world, lacks the humanity to be able to stop and prevent a genocide potentially unfolding, as Yara said, most people probably and scholars and experts have agreed on this. But I think, the grassroots and kind of public mobilization is moving, and I think that we're going to have to work extra hard to shift policy. We're seeing some. I mean, it's a token gesture and a smokescreen, but I think like we need to somehow capture that energy into kind of proper organizing, not just mobilizing stunts but really capturing the energy that we're getting through mass mobilization into more of a sustained, consistent organizing. And of course, you know, I think what is extremely important, and of course, IPS is doing it today, but, you know, always centering Palestinian voices. Listen to the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been saying what is going to happen for years, you know? I mean, so I think centering Palestinian voices is extremely so in any kind of sector space that you have an opportunity to center a Palestinian voice, you know, do that. Because the Palestinians have a lot to say, and I think if we listen to Palestinians a little more, maybe we wouldn't be here today.
Thank you so much, Bushra. Thank you all for joining us today and for making time to listen, learn, and bear witness. We are deeply, deeply grateful to our speakers, Bushra, Yara, and Laith, for their powerful insights and for helping us confront this tragedy with clarity and urgency. And as always, the Institute for Palestine Studies remains committed to documenting and sharing the realities on the ground with integrity and purpose. This work depends on your support. If you value independent research and knowledge production on Palestine, please consider making a donation to help us continue amplifying voices like the ones you heard today. The donation link is in the chat. And thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for being here and for refusing to look away. And until we meet again in our next program, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.